Hi, I'm Edward Luce. I'm here with Jonas Prising, Chief Executive of the ManpowerGroup, America's largest staffing and hiring agency. Jonas, it's great to be with you.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
Well, let's start with your first quarter results, which of course only incorporated the beginning of the real coronavirus lockdown. How do they look, and why was it hard for you to give guidance for the second quarter? Is there literally no visibility now?
Well, so our first quarter results were very much aligned with what we had been expecting as we were coming into the year, up until middle of March, when we saw the European countries implement their lockdown measures. And then subsequently in April, we have seen the same evolution in North America and in now parts of Latin America as well. So that really, although for the quarterly results, it looked as if things were slightly softer. If you look at how the last 2 weeks of March were tracking and really how April was tracking at the beginning, it is a very significant decline. I would say that the decline in most countries is at the levels we saw at the depths of the Great Recession, except in France, where it's roughly twice as deep as it was during the Great Recession. So a very abrupt freezing of the labor markets. And at this point, as we look ahead into all of the discussions we have about opening up the economies and starting to let go of some of the lockdown measures, the detail of how it's going to be done is very, very sparse and not detailed enough for us to be able to provide any meaningful guidance. So we don't really have any visibility. We don't know exactly at what dates, for many countries, they will let go of their lockdowns, and also, most importantly, not how they will do it. Which businesses first? Are schools open? All of the things that impact the labor force. So for the second quarter, we didn't provide any guidance.
So you're in good company in having pretty much zero visibility. You said this is as bad, and in the case of France, worse than what you saw in the depths of the Great Recession. What I was going to ask have you ever seen anything quite like this in terms of disrupting work across the board?
We've never in our more than 70-year history seen anything like this. So when you compare it to the Great Recession, the magnitude, and when I talk about magnitude, I'm talking about both the geographic as in global impact, so the magnitude in terms of industries, as well as the speed of the decline was absolutely and is absolutely unprecedented in our case for more than 7 decades of being in this business. We're a cyclical business, so we're very used to managing economic cycles and their impact on labor markets. And tends to happen in a much more gradual way. Used to be isolated really only to countries, and as globalization has taken place, as we saw in the Great Recession, we learned that we're all very, very interconnected, but it took many months for that to play out. In this case, it all happened within the span of 5 weeks, and the freeze was almost total for many industries.
So, I mean, people say that we're accelerating the digitalization, we're accelerating the future of work in this pandemic experience that we're all living through. Now, in some cases that might be good. My octogenarian parents know how to send a Zoom invite, and I know how to open one. But in some cases, that might not be so good in terms of greater job insecurity, in terms of greater risk aversion on the part of employers. What lasting impacts do you expect to come out in the world of work from this pandemic?
Now, in this particular case, it's of course a very abrupt change. When you step back and you look at the structural changes that have impacted labor market now for the better part of 10 years, we don't really believe that any of those structural changes are going to go off track or not happen. So, demographics and aging population is a big driver of changes. Technology and globalization, of course, as well. What individuals are looking for in terms of their work and what they would like to see happen, that's going to continue as well. And companies have now gotten another reminder that, part of the price to pay for globalization and the impact of technology is that things can change very, very quickly. But having said all of that, if you were to ask me, what do we think is going to be different now looking at, this event in terms of the structural changes that we would expect to have happened over time, I would say that probably the speed with which companies have been able to go and manage their businesses remotely, so leveraging technology while still engaging with their employees, is going to accelerate the evolution, I believe, not so much of remote working, but rather of answering something that workers have told us they want, which is to have more control and more flexibility in terms of their work and life balance. And today, I think the lasting legacy of this will be that companies will be confident that, if you say that I have to go back home at 2, I'm going to pick up my son, and I'll then get back in and I'll do this, and then I won't come in the next day. You will find this, we believe, as an employer benefit that companies are going to use to attract and retain the talent that is going to continue to be scarce because of those structural changes that we saw before the pandemic struck.
So ultimately, is this going to be good for your business? Because that we used to call it temping. I know that word is sort of banned nowadays, but the idea that companies don't want to take the risk of hiring and having all the costs associated with permanent employees, that's been a trend for a while. Is that a trend that this lockdown will accelerate?
Well, I think what you've seen is that over the last 15 years, most of the job growth have come in the categories of work that are not considered the traditional 40-hour full-time employment. So part-time work, gig work, our industry. And, as it relates to our industry, I would think that if companies ever needed a reminder of the importance of having operational and strategic flexibility, this will be positive for our industry. But I should also say that our industry is a little bit unique and sometimes gets bundled up into either the gig economy or outsourced work, because in our industry, in all countries with the exception of the US, we are the employer, or rather, we are the employer of record under specific temporary work legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So we are providing healthcare, medical benefits, have to provide training, and we provide contracts that have a certain time frame. So we actually operate within a legal framework that is entirely determined, and frankly was negotiated, in the mid to late 50s in many cases across Europe and in other parts of the world as well. So we are a very responsible form of flexibility, and I think, on the one hand, people like flexibility and companies like flexibility, but it has to be done in a socially responsible way. So I think our form of flexibility will become even more attractive because there are definitely downsides to the 0-hour contract, the freelancers with no protection, no guaranteed minimum wage, all of those things that really over time will have to get sorted out, because otherwise, you create a very precarious workforce that has no opportunity to progress in life. And I don't think that's going to be healthy for the companies using those services, and certainly not for the individuals.
But would it be fair to say, though, that the cost to companies that do have to have workers in either in the offices, somewhere in a collective social space, is going to rise? There are going to be all kinds of precautions and regulatory changes resulting from this disease. And to try and prevent its recurrence or new diseases that are going to raise the cost of doing business and therefore of hiring people.
It might do. I think, it's clear that, when we come out of this healthcare crisis and fully move into the economic crisis, we're going back to the future, not back to the past in many ways. Now, the back to the future element of this before a virus vaccine certainly means that the costs for employers are going to go up quite significantly, because you have all kinds of issues around, splitting the workspace, space, applying physical and social distancing, more PPE, personal protective equipment, and things like that. Now, whether that's true once we have a cure for this vaccine, I'm not so sure, because at that point, you will have employees confident that they can engage in the workforce in a safe way, and employers confident that they can provide that safe workspace as well. But in the short term, or whatever short-term definition you have until there's a virus vaccine, I definitely think that there's going to be increased cost for employers.
So it seems that a couple of implications to that for the larger question about the shape of capitalism and globalization in the years ahead. One is, that this will accelerate automation and artificial intelligence, robotics. Robots don't give each other viruses. They let alone require health insurance, etc. Another is that the government will have to step in a bigger way to provide better social insurance that's fit for the 21st post-COVID economy rather than the 20th century economy it's currently designed for. Do you expect those kinds of changes? Because it's one thing saying this would be a logical outcome. It's quite another to say this is an outcome I predict.
Well, I think here's our view on automation, and we've always had a little bit of a contrarian view as it relates to automation. It's never what eventually happens in labor markets and how work gets done is not what technology can do, but mostly what people want it to do. And we think automation has, and we know automation has already had a significant impact on jobs that are dangerous, repetitive, and maybe not so interesting for individuals to be engaging in. So automation in manufacturing has been very significant over the last 15 to 20 years, and almost all Western economies have lost a third of their manufacturing workforce. At the same time, of course, we've created many more jobs in the service sector. So we've made up for that. And, in some cases with equally well-paying jobs, in other cases, not so much. So that is one of the reactions that prompted the minimum wage discussion in many, many Western economies as well, that did not keep pace with the increased cost of living. But we don't believe that automation will accelerate because of this. We think automation will continue on its path, but the vast majority of people impacted by technology will be that they will need to work with the technology, which drives a need for more skilled workforce. And you can see a much greater number of employers saying they have difficulties finding the workers they need based on their skill sets. So we think that the automation will drive the need for a skills revolution as it relates to the workforce. And in itself, we believe that that is the biggest defining challenge of our lifetime, because we would have to reskill and upskill a workforce at the scale and magnitude that we've never done before, and at the speed that we've never done before either.
What about globalization? I mean, there's this great thing that companies are going to switch from the just-in-time model, of having efficient global supply chains with minimal wastage, to a just-in-case model where it's far more safety-oriented and there are more stockpiles and there's perhaps a more localized supply chain. That, in a sense, is deglobalization. Do you expect that?
I expect globalization to be a very strong force also going forward, and that's what we hear when we talk to our clients. But what I do think that you will see, which was really already a trend that we've seen for other reasons, be it natural disasters and other things, companies are looking for more resiliency in their supply chain. And that implies that you will be producing things far away, but you will also be making things, services and products closer to shore, so that you have a more resilient supply chain, so we don't have these interruptions that can happen due to many different causes. We've seen natural disasters, we've seen trade wars, and now we've seen a pandemic. So over the last 2 years, we've really seen how big of an impact trade wars can have on global trade in terms of reducing the flow of goods and in some cases services. The pandemic drives home that point again. But the eventual outcome, I think, won't be the pendulum swinging backwards as it relates to globalization. But the way globalization looks will be different, and companies are going to try to build a more resilient supply chain.
Well, final question, but I could ask you for much longer, but we have a strict time limit. Is you operate in many countries, and you also operate in pretty probably every state in the United States.
You do.
which governments, both at the international level and at the national level here in the States, have handled this well, and which have handled this badly?
Well, it's a great question, Ed, because when I look across the world, and of course we had the benefit, sort of seeing this pandemic start already in operations in Asia in January, and then really with some force in February, moving into Europe in March, and now into April, and then of course into the US as well. And now we're just talking to our colleagues in Latin America, and they're starting to see the effects. What's interesting to me is that what seems to be determining the success of mitigating the impact of the progress of the pandemic and reducing the contagion appears to be not as correlated with the severity of the lockdown as much as it is the lockdown in combination with the national character or culture, for a better word. Mm-hmm. So much has been said about Sweden's wild experiment as it relates to letting restaurants be open, schools continue to be open, and travel within the country reasonably uninterrupted in terms of not closing things down. And most companies are continuing to operate in Sweden. But what people forget, in Sweden, there is great trust, there is significant trust in what the government says, and there's a great degree of social solidarity. So when the government says, hey, we're not going to close the restaurants unless they really do something stupid, so they're open, but we highly recommend that you do not go to those restaurants because you could be infecting people. And we also ask that, please limit your travel. Don't go to your second holiday homes. 90% of the population adheres to that advice. And, restaurant business in Sweden is down by 80%. People don't travel in between regions in the country unless it's necessary. So there's a degree of self-management that is apparent in Sweden, equally in Germany, as well as in many of the Asian countries. If you then look at countries like Spain and Italy, in the first phase of the lockdown, if you recall, it was a social distancing aspect of many of the most evident businesses, as in restaurants and hotels and bars, but most other businesses were allowed to continue to open, which for the Italian population meant that this is guidance. We should do it, and I'm going to do it maybe, but I'm certainly not going to miss out on meeting my families. And then you see an explosion in some of the areas that were the most heavily affected. So right. I think culture and context and clarity and simplicity of the messaging to the population appears to have a very big effect on how effective the lockdown measures have been in the different countries.
And to draw a sort of concluding inference from that, there's not been a great deal of clarity coming from the White House.
Now, this is one of the challenges that we have in the US, where we've acted and reacted to this pandemic in very different ways. And frankly, if I were a citizen, and I am a citizen of the United States looking at the situation, I am quite confused. I can't play in golf courses in one state, but I can in another. I can go to a hairdresser in Georgia today, but I can't go here in Wisconsin. So I think the success factor in Germany and Sweden and other countries have been an absolute clarity and alignment from a government and from the healthcare community's perspective on what needs to be done. Some have gone very hard lockdown, like France. Others have gone moderately in that area, such as Sweden and maybe Germany and others, and Korea. But their messaging has been extremely clear and very consistent. And that has been very helpful in conveying to the citizens what they need to do. I think we have a much greater challenge here in the US, where we receive conflicting messages, on this topic, and that does not help limit the contagion and could actually extend the timeline for us before we get past the peak and can start to get back to work.
Well, Jonas, on that note of clear messaging, I think we can fully agree. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your time and insights. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thanks for speaking with me today.